Okay guys, so before we begin, here's a little disclaimer. For this video, instead of writing on the screen, I decided to record a voiceover, and it was a spontaneous decision. And I didn't have time to buy a good microphone, so I'd like to apologize for the sound quality in this video. Anyway, the reason for this decision was that I thought that in this way I would explain some moments about making figures in a much better, more comprehensive way. So guys, let me know in the comments if you liked it, and now let's begin.
Alright, so the first thing we have to do is to create an armature, which is going to be a skeleton for our werewolf. I'm using some aluminum wire and glue. And after some tweaking, it's done. And now let's bulk him up. For doing so, I'm using some aluminum foil, masking tape, and liquid polymer clay. And now let's use our normal clay to give him mass. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to imitate the bone and muscle structure. And this is an extremely important step, because you can't make it right if you don't know the humanoid anatomy. Here I'm doing some fur texturing, which in result I will mostly ended up removing. And now it's time to work on his head, which is arguably the most important part of the whole figure. I added his ears and some hair, and he's slowly starting to get in shape. Now you see me using some baby oil for smoothing out the clay. And now it's time for some dentist job. Let's add his sharp teeth. To make the teeth, I simply use some 2-component epoxy. And now to the most tedious and boring part of the sculpting process, adding his fur. And to be quite honest, that took me forever. And before moving on to the rest of the body, I decided to get the head done by creating the skin texture and scars. This string loop tool you see me using now is really useful for smoothing clay. And as you can see it now, the decision was made to shave off some fur and replace it with skin texture and veins. It's time to move on to his feet. Texturing and adding the claws. Suddenly I decided that I didn't want him to be naked, so let's put on some shorts on him. Wanna know how I ended up with this big plast of clay that resembles fabric? Well, I used my pasta machine, of course. Now I'm carving some holes and tearing up the fabric, and I finished up the shorts by giving them texture. Just because you can never have too much texture, right? Let's make his big, scary, hairy hands. Using some liquid polymer clay to glue the claws. As I've mentioned it at the start of the video, it was going to be a diorama. So I stick to it. Diorama has to tell a story, and this story is about a werewolf who broke free, tore up his chains, and now he's running through the forest. He's very angry and he's looking for his prey. Here I'm mixing some 2-component Karl epoxy to texture the base. So let's make his shackles and chains. Here I simply use some super glue to glue the chains to the shackles. And I knew that I didn't want the chains to be hanging down lifelessly off his wrists, so I decided to shape the chains and glue the chain links together in the shape that I liked. And now let's get him painted. I sprayed the black primer all over his body first, and then I sprayed the white primer from the top, kinda imitating the light striking from above. Alright, and this is going to be his basic flesh tone. Now I'm doing the so-called speckling to imitate the imperfections of the skin. Covering the base coat with matte finish to protect the paint. I mixed these 3 colors to shade his veins. Now to a very important step, the washes. I'm gonna apply all 3 of them one by one. I mix these 2 colors for some additional skin shading. And now to even more important step, highlighting and shading with oils. I prefer oils because they allow me to achieve some buttery smooth blends. The shading and highlighting is what really brings your figure to life, and they can either make your painting great or completely break it for you. So I painted his eyes, and then I've noticed that his skin was a little too pink, and I used this bluish gray to tint his skin a little bit more. And now it's time to paint his fur, and for this I mix these 3 colors. By hand, I added some stranded hairs. I used the same color to paint his nose and then shaded it with a glaze. By the way, glaze is just a very diluted paint. Using acrylics for painting inside of his mouth and teeth. And I finished up the teeth by shading with this oil paint. And now I'm gonna dry brush his fur. To do it, you dip your paintbrush in the paint, then you wipe off almost all the paint off your brush using some tissue or toilet paper, and then you just literally brush the figure with it. Here I'm applying some oil wash, creating additional shading effect. Now it's time to paint his shorts. Here I was actually going back and forth, shading and highlighting, and then shading again, and then highlighting more, glazing, dry brushing, and using all kinds of techniques. But I was not completely satisfied with the skin tone, and so I applied another layer of oil wash on it, just to make it a little darker. And here comes the base, and here are the colors that I mixed for the base coat of the base. Surely I didn't want the rocks to look boring, so I did a lot of dry brushing on them and applied a lot of washes. And finally, it's time for some hardcore terrain building. The first layer was simply watered down PVA glue. And then on the top of it, I simply sprinkled a lot of small rocks and a bunch of different flocking that I could buy online. I even used some real leaves, sticks and moss, and I complemented it all with some fake vegetation. And finally I sealed everything with this very watered down PVA glue. But funny thing, the result did not satisfy me. So I ended up adding even more stuff off the camera. The result, I achieved a really nice looking piece of the forest ground. And now to the shackles. I made my mission to make the shackles look like real metal, heavy metal. And I decided that the best way to achieve this result would be to apply the metal paint by dry brushing it. Alright, a few final touches. And one of them is the UV resin that was applied on his eyes, teeth, gums and tongue. And then I cured it with the UV flashlight. And lastly, I added some saliva using this glue just for a more realistic effect. And that was it. Let's get ready for the final reveal.